Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Qdabra's weekly webinar. This is Patrick Halstead. I'm still on my business trip in Japan, so hopefully the audio will come through. I am recording as well. Lots of short demos for you today. When you're creating InfoPath forms, there's a lot of options to make the forms smart, and we're going to show, I've probably got about 20 things to show you today. I want to make sure that you can hear me okay. Thank you, Brian, for giving me that chat. I'm going to try to talk slow, but if you hear any anomalies during the call, please feel free to chat me, and I'll quickly take a look at my audio settings. So first off, when we talk about smarts, what are we talking about? In InfoPath, you've got validation, conditional formatting, you've got default values, you can add rules with conditions, you can add centralized logic to reduce maintenance, and we'll talk about how to do extensions as well. Now before we get into the demos, momentarily we'd like to draw your attention to an issue that came up in October, and we have a form here that has a bug in it. If you have the Microsoft security patches, which most of you probably have, and you're running the designer and you click on preview, I want you to notice how my date picker here does not show up correctly in the preview. You see how that shows up like that? The icon is incorrect. In addition, if I try to click on the rule inspector, you don't see anything. So let's do a quick show of hands here. How many people are seeing this issue? And we'll see how many people. If you can raise your hand, so it's like Michael, Nathan, you're seeing it. That's great. So we found a really quick and easy fix. I'm going to show you how to do it right now. In Internet Explorer, even if you're using Chrome, you're going to go into Internet Options, Security, Trusted Sites, and you're going to add About Internet into your trusted sites. Make sure that the Require Server Verification checkbox is unchecked. And now, if we go back to that form and preview it, okay, so here's the form. I'm going to preview it now, and you'll see that we get the date picker. In addition, if I click on the rule inspector, we have our rules. So that's a quick update on that issue from Microsoft. Hopefully that is good news for you. And if you've got questions, please put them in the chat window and I will get to them at the end of the call. Like I said, we have a lot of demos today. I want to start off with the validation stuff, and specifically want to talk about several examples, and I'm going to show you those in a minute. The validation is one of the ways in which you can make your form smarter, and it is very useful for reducing input errors. Well, they say garbage in, garbage out, so you want to reduce the amount of garbage that is going into your forms. And you also want to force users to actually finish filling out the forms so you don't have to send them back for more data. So we've got several examples here to show you, and I'll send you these slides at the end. I'm not going to read through the whole slides, but I'm going to show you these examples. And I've got in each of the slides, when you get the deck from me, if you look at my notes, the form that I'm going to demo is here, and I'll show you what I'm going to demo with. It's got a few notes in here so you can reference the demo. And for this first demo, I'm going to show you auto entry. And let's see if I have it open already. So this is a sample form that has some validation in it, and I'm going to preview it. One of the ways we can validate is by automatically sending the person to the next field as they're typing. And this way you know you're going to get exact number of digits entered. So in this case it would be like a phone number. And the way we do this is we have separate fields for each of the for each of the numbers. So you can see on the right underneath my fields, I've got N1, N2. These are attributes underneath the phone field. If I click on the phone field, I have an automatic default value here, which I'll mention more in a second. The default value is concatenating those attributes, and that's then what you see as I'm typing. There's this field here. This is a calculated value that is bound to that phone field, which means that it displays it as I'm typing, but it doesn't let you type it in. So this is one way to force the input. The other thing that you can do with this, the way we do this is we limit the field to exactly one character. So here we have underneath underneath display, we see it, we've got limited text box to one character, and then move to the next control automatically when the limit is reached. Now this is a very clever technique, works in the browser just fine. All of the techniques I'm showing you today work in the browser. Because it automatically forces you to go to the next field, and that can be useful to restrict the amount of data they're typing in, as you just saw, but it can also be useful when you're entering in a barcode. So let's see, does anyone have a 12-digit UPC code? If you can chat it to me very quickly, I will try this next example, and if I don't see one in the next 3 seconds, I'll type in my own. You have to give me a UPC, a universal product code, as a barcode on the back of some product that's on your desk. So I'm going to type in mine, and then if others have them. What this is going to do typically is going to show you what would happen if you had a barcode scanner attached to your form, and it's going to scan in exactly 12 digits in this case. And when I hit the 12th digit, which is a 6, the form will automatically tab to the next field, which will cause the rule to run and automatically query this universal product code database on the internet, showing you that I'm taking my magnesium. So this is a bottle of magnesium on my desk, which you cannot see, but and the way we did that was using the same technique. Here, if we right-click and go into the text box, we're limiting it to 12 characters, so we're automatically tabbing. And when we automatically tab to the next field, the beauty of this technique is it will fire the rule. Now we'll talk about rules more in a second, but the rule on this is to query that product UPC code. So it's actually querying a publicly accessible UPC database, and you can actually use this when you're when you get the samples. It actually calls get product, which is a completely public, one of these public SOAP web services that searches the UPC code. Okay, so let's try this one more time, because we have a couple people here who are playing ball with me today. They're typing in their UPC codes. So we'll go with the first one here from Mark. I got to make sure I can see the number of zeros you got there, Mark. Hopefully I got the number right. And so Mark has on his desk, and you see the picture, the spearmint gum there he's got. The picture shows up for some of the products. This is kind of a clever technique that you can use in your forms to use a barcode scanner to automatically scan in the information. This one that Brian, that you gave me, does not seem to be in the database, so it's not a complete database, but it's kind of interesting for demoing. Okay, so I'm going to close out and go to my next demo here. And the next demo I want to show you is how to do validation by matching patterns. And here we have a very simple sample that has a bunch of different fields: telephone number, postal code, username. And as you can imagine, I'm going to be, I want to validate this telephone number to make sure it's a certain format. And the way I do that is I add a rule to my field. that's a validation rule. I don't know if you can see this in the upper right hand corner here, but this little icon indicates validation rules. There's three types of logic in InfoPath that appear. There's three types of rules: validation rules, conditional formatting rules, and regular action rules. So this indicates this validation, and all of the validation rules will have a condition, and you'll set it based on a pattern. Well, it could be anything. It could be any condition, but in this case, we're using a pattern. So one of the things we can look at here is the actual pattern. So we can say if it does not match a certain pattern, we're going to display validation. In this case, the pattern that we're using is a custom pattern, and specifically, it's the pattern that you see here. Now, this dialog may be a bit daunting to you. But don't let it scare you, because it's easy to create these regular expressions using a regular expression editor on the internet. You can type in regular expression in Google and it will give you regular expression editors, and you can create these patterns. In addition, InfoPath gives you some out of the box, so I could have selected this one instead, but I use my own to show you that I can type it in myself. So here, if we go in and type in the phone number, obviously that's not correct, so we have to type in my cell phone here, and it still doesn't want that, so you have to be careful. It looks like the format is, so I've got a nice screen tip there that's telling me how to type it in, and now it'll be correct. And we've got some other examples here. You can look at these. There's also a link to how to create regular expressions. This is a very useful technique for credit cards and things like that. If you want to make sure that the number of digits match a certain pattern, you can use this. And here again, I'll just take a look at the patterns if you're interested. I've got a lot of demos, so I'm going to move right along. Okay, so the next, so thinking about validation again, the reason why you want to do validation, once again, is to reduce the error rate. One question for you all, let's see if you can answer this. I probably should be hiding this here until you answer it. But the question is, what should you do to ensure that old forms open with meaningful data in a drop-down when the drop-down has changed? So let's say that you have a form that you've published to SharePoint, and the drop-down values have changed. So you filled out a bunch of forms, and they had data in them, and then you changed your drop-down values. Next thing you do is you open up those old forms. The old forms have the old data in them. So to ensure that that old data displays, what you want to do is make sure that the text that you're using for the drop-down value in the display is the same. Now let's look at another example. We have a drop-down here that has these three values here: apple, banana, and cantaloupe. So what I mean by that, last comment, is that these drop-down list box properties, these values, should be the same as the display name. In general, that's not a very good normalized design, but it's good for compatibility because it will always show you what they typed in. If I was using 1, 2, and 3 for my value, and that display apple had changed to apricot or something, then the old forms will open and show apricot, even though the person chose apple. So you do want to make sure that you're using the same text for your value in your display if you want to ensure backward compatibility. Okay, so let's take a look at this example here. So we're going to move on to the next set of smarts, and that is conditional formatting. So conditional formatting is about making your forms flexible, highlighting areas, showing sections, hiding and showing sections, and supporting, for example, dynamic UI. So in this case, a drop-down, if you select other, it should change to allow them to type in a text value. You want to hide the admin block if they're not in the admin workflow state, and so on. And so the way you do this is very similar for all of these techniques, is you're going to set a value in a section. So in this example here, miscellaneous demos. If I select Other, you'll see that the drop-down disappears, and it lets me type in a value. And then, of course, I can go back. The way we do this is the same when we're hiding and showing sections. We're always going to be setting a value. In this case, if it is Other, you can see on the right, we're setting the value of this Other attribute equal to 1. And when that happens, we are hiding this section. So we have a conditional formatting rule here that hides the section if Other is equal to 1. This section, alternatively, is hidden if Other is not equal to 1. And if I click on this button here to revert, it switches it back by setting Other equal to blank. So that's a very simple hide show. Another example of a hide show is our InfoPath starter form. This is a form that we use to start up projects. We have a header, a footer, we have some common components. And you can see here that I have a show help button on the top. And this button is toggling the text to explain to you what this starter form does. And so here, if we look at the show help, you can see it's toggling the help value. And the way it does that is it sets this value toggle help in the main data source equal to the expression not toggle help equals to true. And that has the effect of flipping it. If the toggle help was true, it becomes false. If it was false, it becomes true. So that's another technique for toggling a section. And then down below here, this section actually is going to have the hide show rule. If the toggle help equals false, it hides the control. So in addition, we're doing the same technique when we have tabs. So we're putting all of these sections in this form on the same view. And you can see that whenever they select one of these buttons, the tabs are actually buttons. We are setting the current tab equal to a number, which is the number they selected, 3, 4, 5. And then these sections down below will hide or show based on which section we're on. Let's see if I can find the right one. So there's the first section. That if current tab is not equal to 1, it hides that section. So we basically, instead of using separate views, which are slow to move to and require more maintenance because you have to update everything when something changes, we're using separate sections, and we're using hide show then to flip between them. So when I go into preview again, you'll see if I click on tab 2, it's going to show me something different, and so on. All of those sections are in the main view, and they're just being hidden or shown based on that value current tab. Let's just see here. So I want to show you these other demos. With conditional formatting, you also have the ability to very quickly add highlighting to your form. So in this case, we have a value, and then when we enter it, it becomes white. You're all familiar with this, but it's very easy to do this by simply going up to add rule is blank, and if it's blank, we're going to color it, and that way they see what's required. In this form, we have not actually made these fields required in the data source. We've made them required in the form. And this is a slightly better technique because it gives you more control. So if we enter in some values here, then you can see the button becomes enabled. If I don't have the zip code, the button is disabled. So we're using another rule, a conditional formatting rule, to control whether they click on that button, and that's a best practice. You could put a little red text under the button that says, by the way, you need to fill out the zip code, but if it's highlighted, it's pretty obvious that they need to do that. Okay, and so to explore it further, you've got, let me just show you one more example of conditional formatting. And this is a paging example. Paging is something that comes up quite often when we're developing form solutions because people have a lot of data they want to display. And this form has a bunch of default values for the various fruits, and you can set the page size to be equal to 10, and you can see that we have 26 different fruits corresponding to the letters of the alphabet, and we can page through them. And we're using conditional formatting for all of this. It's very simple to do this. The way we do it is we, on the repeating table, we actually have a conditional formatting rule, two of them, one that hides it if the number is on the future page and one that hides it if it's on the previous page. And so we have to keep track of what page we're on, and that's why we have this page number and page size here. And then we just calculate it. It's pretty easy to do this with a calculation. You can see that the calculation for if it's on a previous page is the page number we're on minus 1 times the page size. So if the current item number is less than that or equal to it, then it should be hidden. So that's another great example of paging. To calculate the item number, we're using a default value, and that's the next thing I want to talk about. Default values are macros. So it's kind of like in Excel, if you have a sum, something like equals sum of something. In InfoPath, you can add any default values to your form, and what we've done here is we've added a default value, which is the count of the preceding sibling, that's the previous fruit node, plus 1. And this essentially automatically numbers all of the items in the list. And that's one example of default values. Another example of a default value is the sum command, which is very simple. I'm sure everyone is familiar with the sum command. If I enter some numbers here, I have a calculation at the bottom that is just summing them up. And the way we do that is simply, this is actually a calculated value, it's not even in the form, it's just calling sum on field 5, and field 5 is the repeating field. So that's very easy to do. You've got a lot of functions you can add here, and what we did here in this repeating table is I've actually added a footer to it by right-clicking and going into the properties display and include footer, and that's where I put the calculated value. Okay, so the reason why you want to use default values is to give people kind of this automatic pre-fill or updating when something changes. And another example is our %complete. So we can actually add a progress bar to our forms to let our users know how far they have to go or how much of the form they filled out. In this example, it's a very small example. We have a bunch of sections, and as the person is filling them out, we're calculating the %complete, and then once they hit 50, we change it to yellow. Once they hit 80, we change it to 100 or yellow, and then 100 is green. And this is per section. Now to do this, we just have a default value. The default value actually is a calculated value. Let's see here, did I close too many? I think I might have closed that form by mistake. Okay, I'm opening the form again. This is the default value. This is actually also a field in the form. And the field has a default value which is set to count the, this is somewhat complex, but basically what it shows here is we're counting the number of nodes that are underneath this current one, descendant or self, that have a question rating that is not blank. In other words, it's filled in. And we're dividing that by the total number, and we're multiplying by 100. And then we have conditional formatting that displays the color based on, oops, I'm going to show you the rules, based on the 3 different criteria, whether it's over 50, over 80, or 75, and then 100. Okay, so that's pretty simple. Let's go back to my presentation. One more thing to look at is a survey form. We have a survey form that we're including with this webinar today that has a bunch of questions, and these questions are in a secondary data source. This makes the form data-driven. So these are all blank questions, but these questions are getting pulled in from this secondary data source, and the way I can tell is the data connections has this thing called questions, and questions is a secondary data source that we can change. So we can go in there and change the questions and automatically pull them in. So this is a very generic survey form, and if you look at the data source on the right, we can double click on these question text here, and you can see that the question text is simply the default value looking up the question text in the secondary data source. If I double click on it, you'll see that it's pulling in the question text from that secondary questions.xml file. Now it could be a list. It doesn't have to be a XML file, and it could also be a database. So this is showing that we're automatically filling in the text for that question based on that secondary file. So those are some examples of default values. They speed up the form entry. They're good. If you have default values in a repeating table, it's not always a good idea to do that, especially if you have a very large repeating table. And when I say large, I mean 10 columns, maybe 20 rows. That's 200 elements. Because if you have a calculated value, it will calculate for every single element in that table. So you want to be careful about adding calculated values to tables that are large. You can always replace a calculated value with a rule, and that's the next thing we're going to talk about. So rules with conditions is the fourth smart that we're talking about today, and this is the most powerful because this gives you the ability to do something if somebody clicks on a button or if they tab out of a field, or in the case you saw earlier, if we scan in a barcode, it automatically switches to the next field and queries the database. So this is very powerful, and this essentially adds workflow to your form where it matters within the form, so you have the data next to it. One of the problems with SharePoint workflows is that to approve them, you go to SharePoint, you click on the item, and you click Approve, but you don't know where the data is. So you have to open up the item, look at it, and you can't approve it with the default out-of-box SharePoint workflow by going into the workflow. You have to actually open up the form. So what I recommend people do is add an Approve button to their forms, and then the form promotes the status, and the workflow then sends the email based on that. So you've got logic in your form that is a rule that is setting status, and then you have your SharePoint workflow, which does email or moving an item or maybe a notification in some other way. So rules are very important. In fact, we've seen a lot of rules already. I'm going to go back to our miscellaneous demo form and show one more very simple rule. So the most simple rule you could have is to simply copy things from one area to another. Here we have an address. If the address fields, and this is our corporate address here in Kirkland, Washington. And if I click on same as billing, it copies those down. If I uncheck it, it resets them. How are we doing that? Fairly simple. We just have rules on the right. This is typically the way you're going to create your rules. You will have separate actions for each of those sets. So we're setting those 5 fields based on the previous one. And then we have a reset that just blanks them all out. So it does require typing these in, but what I did was I did the first one and then I copied this rule using this copy rule command and then pasted it and then changed the actions to just blank it out. So there's always, these commands were added in InfoPath 2010. They're very useful for copying lots of rules. So that's one example. That's a very simple example of rules. Let's look at some more complex examples. We already looked at the UPC lookup. Let's look at a much more complex example, which is the people picker. Now the people picker example today, this is a really cool new technique that we just figured out. You know, we've been working on forms for over 13 years, but we find out new things every day. And we have two new things to show you today. One of them is the people picker. A lot of times you want to add multiple items. Let's go into the library where this is published. So we have this published to a 2013 on-prem site. And I'm just going to open up the form in the browser. And we'll see what this looks like. This solution allows you to add multiple people to a people picker field. Why would you want to do that? Well, sometimes you want to add, you want to notify multiple people in the workflow. For example, if you want to CC them. So here, I'm going to create a new team, and this new team is going to be called Webinars. And for this team, I'm going to actually go into my people picker. I'm going to type in my name, and I'm going to type in Webinars. Actually, I don't even know if Webinars is going to show up, but let's try it. It did not. So we'll type in my name, and we'll type in Hillary's name. Hillary is doing our webinar next week on, we're finally releasing qRules 8.1, and she's actually going to be talking to you about what we did in qRules 8.1. So I can create a team, and this is actually submitting to a list in SharePoint, and then what I can do is I can go to that team. I can update the team. Actually, I made a mistake, and I didn't give the team a name. Or no, I gave it Webinars, that's right. Okay, good. So I'm going to go to Webinars, and I'm going to type in hello world, how are you today? Now, when I click send, what this is doing is it's taking those two team members and it's submitting them to a list. Here's the list. So you can see here, I just got the email, by the way, and so did Hillary. But what it does is it submits these items to a list. So if I hit refresh here, you'll see that we have the webinar's title with Hillary and me in it. Now this is kind of a tricky technique because to get the value out of the people picker, what you have to do is you have to do some tricky things. So let's go back to this form and let me show you a couple of these tricky things we're doing. So one of the things we're doing is when they enter these values, we have to make sure that the people picker is configured to allow for multiple selections. So this is off by default, so you want to make sure that's checked. And then once that's checked, they can enter multiple people. Now those people will show up underneath the people picker, and you have to copy those values out so that the workflow has access to them. In this case, we're actually have a calculated value on this compile display name. We've got three values that we're sending to workflow: compile display name, account ID, and ID. And you can see here we're using this double eval technique, which some of you may be familiar with. It's a very common technique for concatenating a list when you don't know how long the list is. In this case, it's putting together all the names, the display names that are not blank, and then it uses the concat function. So this is kind of tricky, but you don't really have to understand it deeply. You can just, to use it, you can just copy our example. And the same is true for the account ID. We're also doing the same kind of thing with that. Now in this case, we have to remove the claims-based account information so that the workflow can deal with it. And so that's how we're doing that. So it's a little bit different. And then from the workflow end of things, once the form submits to the list, so this form is also doing one other thing that's kind of cool, and that is it's submitting to the list. I'll talk about that in a second. But the workflow is right here, and if we go into the workflow, you'll see that it's the email team workflow. It's very simple. It just emails the people based on the people picker. So we're actually promoting those values as a people picker node. Let's go back to the form and I'll show you here in the list. So the list has this column called people picker, which is where those two values are getting promoted. And it's using that value to create the to list. Now this allows you to email multiple people from a form, and you can also CC them, and you can do other things. Okay, so one thing with rules that's kind of tricky is debugging. So one thing I recommend you do is you add a debug section. I have a form. Our starter form has an example of the debug section at the bottom, and you can see that you can add in the commands that you're running. If you're running rules, you can add different actions to log where you're at to see which rule is fired. Now this debug section is hidden by default. We're using conditional formatting to do that, and this is a trick. You can set the section to always be hidden by saying 1 or 1 equals 1. And if you just say blank, it won't hide it, but if you put in some condition, it will. And then of course when you want to debug it, you just take that off, and then you can actually see the debug section when you preview it at the bottom here. Okay, so let's go back, and I think we're getting close to done. We're a little bit going over, so I appreciate your patience with me. When you're dealing with forms and you have a lot of buttons that do submits or queries, you want to make sure that you centralize the logic for those buttons into one area, and this we call centralized rules. So in this form, we have a save and a submit button. Both of these buttons are actually just setting. You can see that this save button sets the value of submit equal to save. The submit button sets the value of submit equal to submit. So they're both setting the same field in form logic equal to a different value. And then what we do is we have in our form logic we've put all of the rules underneath this submit node. So the benefit of this is that if the submit or the save changes, I don't have to try to find out where it is that it changed. I just go in here and change it here. So rather than have rules on every single button in all of your forms, I recommend centralizing the logic in a secondary data source. You can also put form logic in your main data source. In fact, let me show another example. In the survey form, we also have form logic. When we click on this field here, we're actually this radio button is setting the other radio buttons to be blank, and the way it does that is by setting this. This is actually the secondary data source as well. So we're using a secondary data source here, and it's triggering some logic that goes through and then sets all of the corresponding, because all the questions are in the same area, we have to be careful to blank out only the answers for the question ID that matches. If we preview this form again, I can show you that. The survey form has this has separate questions for these radio buttons, but notice if I select them, it's automatically blanking out the other ones. This is kind of tricky to do without code, and this form has no code in it. This form is just stock info path. And the way to do it is you set a value in a secondary data source, and then you use a trigger to go through and clear out the other values. And you can look at this form for more details or contact us if you get lost. We've got a customer that just went through this, and so I'm showing you this technique today. So once again, when you're using centralized logic, it's better to put the form logic in a secondary data source because it keeps your main data source pure instead of polluting it with lots of static information that does not persist. You can use a secondary data source for state information, and the toggle help we saw earlier would be the same in the same boat. So a couple more slides here. Sometimes you have to extend info path. There's a lot of times when you can't do what you want to do. We saw earlier about submitting to a list. If we look at the people picker example here, if we look at the submit button, the send button, the send button is actually submitting to that list, and of course this is using form logic too. So this sets the submit, and this one is in the main data source. So this is using not a best practice, but we're still using form logic, which is a best practice. And so when submit is set, what happens? it goes through and it submits the items to the list using the qRules submit to SharePoint list command. This is a very popular command in qRules. This takes a mapping and it automatically maps repeating data to a list, and in this case the repeating data is the people's names. So that's an example of qRules, which is in a common library. So the real reason why you want to use a common library is when you're extending your form with code, you don't want to have to maintain separate code for each of your forms. So you want to use a common code base, and we've already done it. We've had qRules out for over 8 years. It's got 160 different commands. You just inject your forms with it. Hillary will be talking about it next week. There are lots of commands like inserting, getting the input parameters, generating GUIDs, looking at execution history. I mean, there's 160 different commands. If you are using Office 365, you don't have the sandbox anymore, but you can still use qRules by converting your form using Forms Viewer to view the form. So the InfoPath form does not get converted, but you just point it at our new Forms Viewer app. The Forms Viewer app includes 43 qRules commands by default without relying on any code. So it's all within the Forms Viewer app. And your forms should work in Forms Viewer without any change. So that's a common library, and lots of things to talk about there, but I want to give you a quick explanation of that area. One more thing to talk about is this people picker with workflow. I already talked about this. This is using the submit to SharePoint list. It does enable parallel workflows or notifying multiple people. The one thing that's challenging with this is when you have to update the people picker. Unfortunately, you can't update the people picker by typing in the values. You have to actually use a separate field. So here we have a fake button that looks like the people picker, but it really isn't. And it just basically says us to edit it. And here we're using hide show to hide and show these two sections based on that. So when you have to update a people picker values after it's been saved, you have to use this technique. You have to pull the values out of the people picker and then have a button that sets them back in so that it will automatically work. It's a little bit tricky, but that's a new technique that we just discovered lately. And there's some links here. Our training site is open. If you've taken our training before, you can log in. If you want to look at this example, please email me and we can send you the login credentials. So just in closing, I want to take a moment to let you all know that we are making a lot of progress with this replacement for InfoPath. We've had it out now for over 3 years, and we have lots of people using it, and we're really excited because it adds new features to InfoPath. It allows you to continue using your forms as is without any concern of the meteor strike from Microsoft. It's faster in the browser. Once the form opens, there's no postbacks, so you realize better performance, and you can do things like external submits without having to log in, so it reduces the license cost potentially. It is in 365 and on-prem. If you need a demo or you would like us to help you install it, it is free. We do charge for support, but you won't need much of that. So we are doing this in GitHub too. It's open source, and we're going to be adding a lot of functionality to this over the next year. It already is, I'd say, 85–90% feature compatible. It doesn't support digital signatures yet. We may never get to that. But we're going to be adding new things. For example, we've already added responsive display. So if you've got a phone or a desktop, it will change the view. If you have a CSS, you can add a CSS to your form. In addition, things that InfoPath can't do, like offline caching, actually InfoPath can do that, but in the browser it can't. So we are going to add offline caching to it and signature controls to it. And if you have other things you want us to add, let us know. We're really excited about the future of forms. Now that we have this solution, we're not blocked on Microsoft making a decision. Thank you very much for being here. Any questions? Got a quick five question survey at the end for you, and then I'll send you the package. If you don't have questions, once again, I want to thank you for being here. We do have a webinar next week, and that's Hillary again talking about qRules 8.1. And this was my last webinar in Japan. I'll talk to you in a couple weeks. Have a great day.